Hello, welcome to this week's lecture. This is the last lecture in the semester, so I wish I could end the class on a higher note. But once again, this is going to be one of the more pessimistic lectures. We're talking about democracy, equality, two things that are defining what this country is about, and social Darwinism, which is an ideology directed against both democracy and equality. Before I get into the lecture, however, I want to say a few words about the source that you read, this guy E.L. Godkin, where he's talking about the South, and he is talking about the freed people. And he is doubting their ability to function as members, as equal members of a free society. He is blaming the corruption in the South, of which arguably there was quite a bit. State governments were handing lucrative contracts without bidding to northern companies that were financed by northern capital, with business ties to the white politicians who were members of the Republican Party that had come to the South as carpetbaggers to run the government there, because among the free people who were politically in power and whose elected representatives made up a majority of state legislators in many southern states, there weren't a whole lot of people who had the educational background, although they were catching up fast, to run a state government. This is one of the things that Godkin talks about. We have dispensed of the talent and qualification needed to run a state government. And he means by that the southern whites, the slaveholders, the defenders of slavery, the rebels, who were not allowed to take these government posts. So what is odd about Godkin being part of the first wave of the backlash against Reconstruction, the first wave of wanting to undo the results of the Civil War, is that he is a Republican of the first hour. His journal, from which this op-ed is taken, The Nation, was founded precisely to back Lincoln, to have a voice and a genuine voice of Republicans who were in favor of Lincoln and his drive to abolish slavery. So how is it that the guy who's the editor and founder of this journal is now, in so many words, coming out against African Americans as free and equal members of this country, of this society? Or how is he doing that? How is he setting up that argument? So I like to use a prop in this lecture, which is one of those delicate mechanisms that Godkin is talking about. And by delicate mechanism, he's referring, of course, to government, a complicated piece of machinery. We don't want just anybody messing with it. And of course, in a democracy, the way lots of people mess with the machinery of government is by electing their representatives. So here I have a self-winding watch. See, it functions as a normal watch. It's not a status symbol, it's not really expensive, but it's a nice, solid piece of machinery. So here, through the glass on the back, you can actually see the movement. You see it moving. And then there is also this weight that you see turning, and that is how it self-winds. The wearer of the watch moves around, the weight moves with it. And that loads the spring, which gives off the kinetic energy it stores to drive the watch. So you actually don't need batteries. You don't really have to wind it if you wear it every day. It's a great thing. When it broke, I needed to have it fixed, and I couldn't find anybody in Fresno to do it. So I ended up sending it to Switzerland, where it was manufactured. And I imagine some old man halfway up a mountain got out his tools, looked at it through a magnifying glass, and fixed it. And I wouldn't have anybody else touch it, because clearly if you don't know what you're doing with something like this, you'd break it. So this is a piece of technology that a 19th century person like E.L. Godkin could clearly understand. And this is maybe one of those things he's talking about. You wouldn't want just anybody messing with it. So if you buy into the analogy he makes, that government is just like this watch, that if you don't have a certified technician, you don't want that person messing with it, then you've bought into a central argument against democracy. Then you will want qualifications for voters. You want to exclude people from the right to vote if they don't meet those qualifications. And you're abandoning the fundamental assumption of democracy that, yes, all people are capable of understanding what's going on in the world, of making informed decisions between different political options, and then voting and expressing their will at the ballot box. And this assumption, of course, is what this country was founded on, even if there wasn't democracy to begin with. And we'll return to that in a minute. The assumption that the people are equally as capable as a privileged few to understand what a state is and how it is run, what a government is, that is built into the assumption of making a republic, of getting rid of a king. The foundation, as you recall, for the monarchy is to say the blue-blooded aristocracy are special kinds of people. They alone can understand the complex questions of statecraft and political philosophy that go into running a government. And Tom Paine and the American founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, said, no, that is not in fact true. The claim to exclusive knowledge and wisdom that the aristocracy and the king have is bogus. It's made up. Everybody is just as capable. Maybe not everybody is fully capable of understanding everything, but no one group under no set of criteria is ever going to be more capable than others. So the best safeguard against the voters messing up is to have more people vote. The more the merrier, because ultimately people are equally capable of using their brains and get things right, or equally incapable, but it comes out this incapable, it comes out the same. So let's now, with this introduction, go and look at the lecture. Here it is. And it's a little bit dated. I haven't really updated it since 2010 because, let's face it, nothing has changed essentially since 2010. If anything, it's only gotten worse. The thesis argument of this lecture is that if you're looking for an explanation of why you get a backlash against democracy in the 1870s, and that you do, and Godkin is an example of that, the reason for that is an increasing concentration of economic power in the hands of corporations. And we talked a little bit about that last week. The railroad companies that own the Trans-Mississippi West are treating the farmers, who are independent property owners, like second-class citizens. The new industrial working class in the expanded factories of the East that make anything to do with coal, metal, wood, textiles, and so forth, are working for hunger wages. And when they go on strike, government and corporate hired guns bring down the hammer on them. And in the South, the free people are fighting for the right to own their own piece of land, and against the political and economic forces that want to essentially bind them to the soil, like serfs, as sharecroppers who will have no chance to ever get that kind of economic independence by making the kind of money you would need to buy the land for yourself. So all these people, farmers in the Midwest, who are white, Protestant, often Northern and Northeastern European, the working class in the Northeast, most of whom are of English and British IELTS and German, and then also increasingly Southern and Eastern European background, as well as the African Americans, the freed people of the South, are all challenging that corporate power, which of course has one root in the big cities, notably New York, where financial power is increasingly concentrated. So they're up against the same foe, but they're not making common cause. The horror in the mind of the elites and the people who write for them, like Godkin, who write from their point of view and their perspective is that these common people might discover that there is more that they have in common than what divides them. The fact that some are white, some are black, some are recent arrivals, and others have been in the country for a long time. Some are Protestants, others are Catholic. That all doesn't matter quite as much as the fact that they're all getting, what's the technical term, screwed over by corporate America. So as a safety, before you get to that point where these people might make common cause, the white elites in this country are abandoning their commitment to democracy and equality. And that commitment had existed. I mean, Lincoln gave a clear endorsement of democracy and equality, if you recall the Gettysburg Address. He considered it to be the purpose of government, to make life better for everybody, not just for a handful of people. So this is a big reversal. But I want to talk not so much about the economic basis of that, because when it comes down to it, that's pretty simple. It's about privilege and power and wealth. But I want to look at the ideological lineages. And one of the people in the 1880s, starting in the 1870s, that became a forethinker, a bellwether of this backlash against democracy, was a man called Henry Adams. The name gives away his pedigree. He is the great-grandson of John Adams, the second president of the country, and the grandson of John Quincy Adams, or possibly a nephew. I have to look this up. This doesn't seem right. Anyway, but he is the descendant from one of the best regarded political families in the country. If you remember, his great-grandfather, John Adams, writing to people around the time that the Declaration of Independence was drafted, John Adams is laying out his argument against democracy, saying that what people who have no education, but more importantly, who have no property, are going to be doing is they're going to mess it up for everybody, so you can't give them the right to vote. Because who's next? Jews, Catholics, women, children? We can't have that. So it is that spirit, revived, intensified, that speaks out of the works of Henry Adams. One of his most important books was a novel called Democracy. I don't recommend you read it because it's badly written and boring, but I've read it so that you don't have to. And I want to give you a brief synopsis of the content. It is about a young, wealthy woman, recently widowed, independently wealthy from New York. Great patriot, believes in America and this experiment in Republican self-government. So she moves from New York to Washington, D.C. to be where the magic is happening. There, she meets a few individuals who become important for her life story. A senator from Ohio, who she admires for being a man of the people and a quintessential representative of this democracy that she likes. The other is a disgruntled and charming former slaveholder who lives just across the Potomac in Virginia. He is a Southern gentleman, he believes in inequality, and he thinks the government is absolutely corrupt because it has been tainted by the grubby hands of the people. The protagonist of the story marries the senator from Ohio only to then find out that the other guy was right. And they're, of course, both suitors. They both want to marry her. Not for her money, although it does turn out, yes, the senator from Ohio was after her money, whereas the good Southern gentleman who doesn't believe in equality was actually in it for the love. But it was too late at that point. So with that kind of disappointment, this buyer's remorse that has afflicted the entire upper class of the country when it comes to promoting equality and democracy is reflected in that novel. There's also a healthy dose of anti-Semitism in it, for which Henry Adams was known. One of the most corrupting influences for taking away the government of the people and making it about just enrichment is the Jew, represented by a guy who's a speculator, whose name is German Jewish, Schneidekupon, which isn't really very original. It means coupon cutter. from the little pieces of paper that you cut off the stock certificates and so forth before they had computers. And then you took that to the bank and they gave you your dividend or your interest payment. So he is really the guy who pulls the strings and who is corrupting the democracy. And this book was widely read as insightful at its time. So it reflects the cultural moment where many people who were members of the upper class followed Adams to his conclusion that democracy is bad, it corrupts, it rewards mediocrity and decadence. What you really want is a government by men of honor and virtue. And the people, the common people, don't have that. The only way you get honor and virtue is if you're independent of the opinions of the masses. How do you get to be independent of other people's opinion? If you're financially, economically independent of them. So what that then amounts to is that you're independent of mind if you're independent of means. And so we're back at the same point where we were with John Adams in 1776. Only the rich should have influence on the decisions of government. You want a government, for all practical purposes, of rich white men, because the people can't be trusted with making decisions. So another historical precedent for this dismissal of democracy and equality is not just John Adams, of course, but also his old friend Jonathan Sewell, who you might remember. Sewell, loyalist and defender of the British king, old-time resident and born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, nonetheless loyal to the king, agreed with Adams on that essential assumption that people without property, men and women, have no will of their own. They need somebody to take care of them, people with money, employers, husbands, and so forth. Now, George Fitzhugh is another figure we've discussed more recently, who also doesn't believe in equality, who considers inequality to be a virtue, justified, elevated by religion, tradition, and scholarly opinion throughout the ages, something that was messed up in 1776 when the country foolishly embraced these ideas of democracy and equality. It's the same figure of thought as that which you found in Sewell and Adams. Now, however, it is racialized, and it's about black and white. For Henry Adams, it is racialized also to include Jews, not necessarily as a religious group, but already the beginnings of the racial thinking about Jews versus Gentiles, the racial anti-Semitism that is the product of the 19th century and distinct from the anti-Judaism that was religious, not about genetics, of the Middle Ages. If you add another thinker to the picture, that completes this racial turn, and that is Charles Darwin. His Origin of the Species was published in 1859. Now, of course, Darwin was a biologist. He was not interested in human society. And in fact, the social Darwinism that takes disconnected bits of Darwin's theory of biology, animal and human, and applies them unmediated to human society, to sociology, social Darwinism doesn't follow from Darwin. It's a misuse of Darwin's theory. So you can't blame Darwin for it. He didn't endorse social Darwinism. He argued, and if you've heard the phrase of the survival of the fittest, he argued that the way that species thrive, that they succeed in a changing environment, is by adapting, is by being better at fitting in to that changing environment. So the fitness of the species in the survival of the fittest is not about whether or not the species has a gym membership and works out. The fitness is really about if somebody will hopefully eventually say to you, we think you're a good fit for this job when you're applying. In order for the species to be a good fit for that changing environment, cooperation between the members of that species and with the other species in that environment is a key element. So the social Darwinist notion that it's really a free-for-all, a ruthless struggle to kill or be killed, to wrestle your way and to muscle your way to the top, that is alien to Darwin's thinking. That is a translation to human society that takes its logic out of that human society and then looks for evidence in biology to justify what, from your interest within human society, you've already come to conclude. So this jungle, where it's a dog-eat-dog world, and of course the choice of animal species for the social Darwinist analogies, it's man is man's wolf. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It doesn't even do the canine species much justice to blame it all on the dogs. But why not bees and birds and butterflies and fish, for instance? No, it is certain animals that the social Darwinists will point to that have a reputation for ruthlessness and as killers that then stand in for explaining nature and then saying, well, and humans are part of nature, so they're just like it. But of course, in nature, this jungle of the social Darwinist imagination doesn't actually exist. There is no ecosystem, no biological system or habitat that is characterized by a constant destructive force of species eating each other, and then the one that eats the most and is the most ruthless somehow coming out on top. The only place and time, in fact, where this type of jungle does exist is in the capitalist marketplace humans created at a specific point in time in the 19th century. Here, and as participants in the market, people did behave like the animals of the social Darwinist imagination, the survival at the expense of others, and with the impetus to become the richest, and that where one's own gain is ideally also somebody else's loss. So this social Darwinism begins as a set of ideas that reflect the experience and the worldview of the white elites that are the winners of this process of industrial expansion and the consolidation of power at the top in the 1860s and 70s. It takes the laws of the marketplace and declares them to be natural laws, meaning that it would be foolish to say, you pass a law that the number pi shall be 3 even because it's too complicated to remember all the digits. You can't change a natural law. Water is going to boil at 100 degrees centigrade if you have 1 bar of atmospheric pressure, and so on and so forth. You can't legislate that away. It is not open to democratic decision making. So if you get people to buy that the laws of the market, which are of course human products and are specific to a particular society and historical moment in time, if you convince people that the laws of the market are natural in the same way, then legislation to mitigate them would be foolish likewise. So you just leave it to the market and let it play out in the natural selection of people with wealth who rise to the top because they are better, because they are more suited, thanks to their strength and ruthlessness, than others. And this, of course, gives you ideological ammunition against anybody who is challenging that system of privilege and inequality. Who are the people going to ask to help them? The only other instance with any kind of power in society is, of course, the government. The government in a democracy and in a republic is the instrument of the people. So if within the population, within society, there is an imbalance of power, that will be the place to go to. You ask the government to level the playing field. But if you have already bought into the logic of social Darwinism that says that failure is a result of your own incapacity to succeed, you're too weak or not moral enough, not driven enough, not disciplined enough, and that must be the reason, not the nature of the playing field or the rules of the game of why you failed, then to ask for government help is an acknowledgement of your failure, and you therefore don't deserve that. So whether it is the farmers in the Midwest who are saying government needs to make rules so that railroads can't price us out of our farms by the rates they charge to take our grain to Chicago and further to market, because we are captive to their monopoly power. There is one railroad in this town, we're either going to ship with them or we're not going to sell anything. Or the workers who are saying we want the right to unionize, we don't want the corporations to have the right, when we strike, to bring in hired guns and kill us. Or the free people, and this is where last week we read the letters, who are appealing to the government and saying, this land has been sold from under our feet, with the houses on it that we built, with the cotton on it that we planted, in an auction that was not an open bidding process, to somebody who is politically connected, who is now telling us we can work for him or get off the land and out of the houses, and he's paying us not enough to make a living, and we're compelled to buy everything we need from the store that he owns, and at the end of the day, we owe him more than we made. And this is, by the way, true of company towns where the company owns the factory, which is plucked down somewhere in the countryside, and then everything around it, the company town, the schools, the churches, the stores. So you're paying your wages right back to the company, and you often end up owing them money for the privilege of working for them. So all these people make demands of government. They're saying, outlaw these practices, regulate them. And in some cases, they succeed at the state level. They pass laws that regulate railroad rates. They use the power of state governments in the South to fight against land speculation. And there are some signs that maybe that could be catching on, that these groups, these three main groups, could be making common cause. In response to that, what you see in the 1870s is increasingly the use of government power against people who make demands. One of the major relocations of the army that happens in 1877 is the withdrawal from the South, which leaves the Ku Klux Klan in charge. They, from that point onward, are the only people with weapons and organized power. Whereas before, the army protected the free people against the Klan. Now they're at the mercy of the Klan. The army is then used against striking workers in the North. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone here. And it is also then sent further west to remove what is left of the Native American population. All the while, to the sound of pundits and politicians praising free enterprise, free markets, and a government that doesn't interfere in the markets, these same people are handing out millions of dollars of public money for contracts fulfilled by private corporations. The template for that is kind of the Transcontinental Railroad, still built during the Civil War, but completed only after the end of it, through land grants and charters, the enrichment of people who are already quite rich at the expense of everybody else. But if you are a social Darwinist, if you believe that the strong deserve more and that they deserve every bit of their wealth because they are better by virtue of their strength, which is kind of a circular logic, but that's how it works, then this is not a problem. You will want to reward the strong. You will want to punish the weak. You want to weed them out eventually because they're what keeps the strain of the race down. One of the more highbrow popularizations of this type of elitist thinking, of anti-egalitarian thinking in the 19th century came out of Germany. Surprise, surprise. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who mostly wrote in the 1870s, developed this concept of the superhuman or Übermensch. You might have heard of it. He argues that people who are inherently superior because they have put behind them any concern with morality, especially regard for their fellow man, get to do things to their fellow man because they have gained superior insight into the nature of things. One of his main works is called Beyond Good and Evil. So if you realize that the categories of good and evil are something that was imposed on you by people who want to keep you down, by telling you do good or don't do evil, then you're truly free. You're living up, you're proving yourself to be a superhuman, a superior human to the rest of the race, because you're seeing through that. In that vein, Nietzsche believed that Christianity was a prime example of slave morality. I mean, who worships a God that gets himself killed, that is weak and suffering in his last days on earth? Clearly, this is a religion for people who couldn't do things on their own. It's a religion for the weak. So one of the first things to do to renew mankind and put it back on course is to get rid of Christianity and all its concern for, you know, the weak and so forth. So social Darwinism is, of course, directly opposed in its value system to the original version of Christianity, which makes it all the more odd that in evangelical Protestantism today, in this country, there is a perfect merger of social Darwinism with elements of Christianity. But if you've heard anything about Nietzsche, you might have also heard that he was revered in German fascism. Under the Hitler regime in the 1930s, the German soldiers who marched out on their missions of conquest and the annihilation of populations the German regime considered racially inferior, often did that with copies of Nietzsche's works in their backpack to read up on why exactly they have a right to kill these inferiors and why they're doing a good thing in the bigger picture, the right thing by doing so. So Nietzsche is universally recognized as a perhaps against his intentions, but nevertheless as somebody who informs fascism philosophically in the 20th century. And of course, another popularization of this celebration of ruthlessness is through the journalist Ayn Rand, who is revered on the right in this country. Her novel Atlas Shrugged, published in the 1950s, had a revival of sorts after the election of Barack Obama as president, when at Tea Party rallies, copies of the book were simply waved as a kind of shorthand for the value system that goes into that book and into her other books, and the leadership of the Republican Party. Atlas Shrugged, the title, takes its clues from Greek mythology. Atlas is the giant on whose shoulders the world rests. You might have heard about the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. They were considered the edge of the world by the Greeks, who didn't know there was much world beyond that. So they imagined that the world was a disk and it rested on the shoulders of a giant who was standing underneath the world right where the Atlas Mountains were. So if the world is resting on the shoulders of somebody and that person shrugs, then the world falls into the abyss. Atlas, in this analogy, are the ruthless, creative individuals who truly create value, the entrepreneurs, your Bill Gateses and everybody like Andrew Carnegie, the people who are mythologized as the creators of innovation. Everybody else using the government to take away money from these creative geniuses to redistribute it to the less deserving are holding them back and therefore keeping the world a worse place than it could be if only you let these ruthless individuals do their thing. So what if these better few stopped working with the rest of the population? What if Atlas shrugged and said, okay, you don't appreciate what I'm doing for you, I'm just going to walk away. And that is, of course, what happens in this novel. The rich and powerful simply withdraw from society to their own little island and consequently civilization collapses because it turns out they were the only ones holding things together. So this is a pure formulation in fictional form, once again, of the philosophy of social Darwinism. And in 2009, both at these Tea Party rallies, but also in outlets like Fox News, the books Rand wrote were recommended to listeners, to viewers. And one of the people who rose to prominence in the Republican Party at the time, Mr. Paul Ryan, the main author of the present 2017 tax bill, has always been known and has always wanted to be known as an acolyte of Ayn Rand. And the recent quote of him that he's always been giddy about slashing spending on Medicare, for seniors and Social Security, like veterans who have limbs missing and all that, that reflects that kind of thinking. Or, and this is really where the lecture is dated, Mitt Romney, who also gave a good, in a nutshell, formulation of social Darwinism in his quote that there are almost half the people who somehow believe that they're entitled to stuff like healthcare, food, or housing, and that his job is not to care about those people, but rather force them by withdrawing the support that government lends them to finally take care of themselves and take responsibility, in a dramatic misjudgment of how an economy actually works for somebody who presumably made his money as a businessman. From this point onward, I haven't bothered to keep track of the quotes that prove this embrace of social Darwinism by this particular current of American political life, because there is just too much of it. I'm working on a book on the subject, so look out for that, and of course buy it in multiple copies if you get a chance. So this is the end of this lecture. This is a dark outlook of inequality and ruthless greed by people who are powerful. And it looks familiar. It makes the 20th century where, the backlash against this kind of power grab by the rich and powerful was progressivism, a movement in the early 20th century that created the state, the United States government as we know it, with the Federal Reserve, with antitrust laws, with an acknowledgement that yes, the federal government doesn't just have the right, but the duty to step in and level the playing field between exceedingly powerful monopolies and everybody else. That a free market doesn't function as a free thing at all, if not for government setting the parameters that rein in the excesses of people who have the means and the incentives to skew the process to get better results for themselves. But that is, at this point, who knows, whenever you're going to be watching this lecture, how things have turned out, but this is not over. The question of why and for what purposes the power of government shall be used remains a hotly contested issue. And the questions that were on people's minds in the 1870s about democracy, about equality, about the rights of individuals regardless of their wealth, skin color, and religion were very much front and center of debates in this country. If you do want to trace American history from there to now, then of course you can take History 12, which is the sequel to History 11 and starts with 1877. But if you don't do that, and this is it, then I wish you good luck on whichever finals and other remaining work you have to do, and sign off and wish you a good break.